What would you do if you were forced to marry a millionaire 20 years older than you? A 21-year-old woman walks down the aisle in a white dress that never felt so heavy, her eyes dry as the desert, without a single spark of happiness. What no one knew was that this forced marriage would become the most unexpected transformation of their lives. Where are you watching us from? Tell us your country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button for more amazing stories like this one. The white dress had never felt so heavy to Eleanor as it did in that moment, while she walked down the aisle of the old St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. Her eyes, dry as desert sand, lacked the sparkle that should adorn any bride's face. At 21, she advanced with measured steps toward a man 20 years her senior, whose hands trembled not from the emotion of the moment, but from a condition he carefully concealed from the world. The organ played a melody that, rather than celebrating love, seemed more like a requiem for the youth she was about to sacrifice. The gazes of the guests, familiar faces but strange souls, followed her with a mixture of compassion and morbid curiosity. Everyone knew this marriage was the last card played by a family ruined by debt and poor decisions. Sometimes fate leads us down paths we would never choose of our own volition, only to show us that true freedom is born when we accept the inevitable and seek light in apparent darkness, thought Eleanor as she felt the weight of her future being sealed with each step. Harrison Thornfield waited for her at the altar, imposing in his tailored dark suit, his black hair peppered with grey that gave him a distinguished air. His face, marked by years and experiences Eleanor could only imagine, remained impassive. However, an attentive observer would have noticed how he hid his right hand in his pocket, trying to disguise the tremor that had tormented him for years. When she finally reached his side, Eleanor caught the scent of sandalwood and fine tobacco emanating from him. It wasn't unpleasant, but neither did it awaken any particular emotion in her. Their gazes met for a fleeting moment, and Eleanor thought she glimpsed something beyond cold determination in those amber eyes. Was it vulnerability? Or perhaps a reflection of her own resignation? "You look beautiful," he murmured, so softly that only she could hear. Eleanor nodded slightly, unable to respond with a lie. She didn't feel beautiful. She felt like a porcelain doll about to be placed in a gilded display case, destined to be admired, but never truly touched or understood. The minister began the ceremony with words about love and devotion that rang hollow in the vastness of the church. Eleanor watched as a ray of sunlight pierced through the stained glass windows, projecting fragments of color onto the marble floor. She wondered if her life would ever have as much color as those patches of light, or if she was condemned to live in the shadows of decisions others had made for her. What no one knew, not even she at that moment, was that behind this ceremony imposed by circumstances, a 12-month journey was beginning that would transform two lost souls into something neither could have imagined possible. Thornfield Manor rose imposingly at the end of an avenue flanked by century-old oak trees. With its Victorian style, complete with towers, balustrades, and arched windows, it seemed plucked from an old tale where happy endings were as improbable as finding warmth in its stone walls. During the first month of marriage, Eleanor's footsteps echoed lonely through the marble corridors. The rooms, though luxuriously decorated, remained cold and impersonal, as if the mansion itself refused to accept her. That March morning, Eleanor watched the rain beat against the library windows. Her fingers absently traced the spines of books that no one seemed to have read in decades. Dust danced in the rays of light that filtered timidly through the clouds. "Mrs. Winters asks if you'd like to review the menu for tonight's dinner," announced Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, interrupting her thoughts. Eleanor turned, meeting the stern but not unkind face of the woman who had served the Thornfields for over 30 years. In her gaze was a mixture of curiosity and wariness, as if she still hadn't decided whether the young wife deserved her respect. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. Please tell her I trust her judgment," Eleanor replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "As you wish, ma'am. Though you should know that the master dislikes surprises at the table," the housekeeper replied, subtly emphasizing the word ma'am, as if it were a title Eleanor had yet to earn. When Mrs. Holloway withdrew, Eleanor sighed deeply. The traditions of local high society required that she learn the art of household management, attend charity teas on Tuesdays, and always maintain a pleasant face during the formal Friday dinners. These elements weren't just social rules, but invisible chains that shaped every decision she made. That afternoon she decided to explore the gardens despite the persistent drizzle. Wrapped in a wool coat, she walked among neglected rose bushes and silent fountains. The garden, like everything in that house, seemed to exist more as a statement of status than as a place to enjoy. Upon returning, she found Harrison in the main drawing room, reviewing documents with a concentrated expression. Their eyes met for an instant, and Eleanor noticed how he quickly hid his trembling hand. "Did you find anything interesting in the library?" he asked, surprising her with this attempt at conversation. "Books no one has opened in years," she answered honestly, "and a garden crying out for attention." A shadow of interest crossed Harrison's face. "The garden was my mother's passion. After her death, no one really knew how to care for it." It was the first time he had mentioned his family, and Eleanor felt a small crack in the wall of formality that separated them. "I could try to restore it," she ventured to suggest, seeking something, anything, to cling to in this empty marriage. Harrison observed her attentively, as if truly seeing her for the first time since the wedding. "You would need help. I'll speak with Giles, the old gardener. He retired years ago but might be willing to advise you." This small exchange, seemingly trivial, was the first step on an uncertain path. Eleanor didn't know it then, but she had just planted a seed in more fertile ground than she imagined. That night, as they dined in a silence broken only by the tinkling of silver cutlery against porcelain, Eleanor observed Harrison's hands. They trembled slightly as he held his wine-glass, and for the first time she felt genuine curiosity about the man to whom she had tied her life. What secrets did he hide behind his facade of a ruthless businessman? What wounds did he conceal beneath that distant courtesy? The answer would come sooner than she expected, and in a way she could never have imagined. The full moon bathed Eleanor's bedroom in silvery light when the sound woke her. It was 3 in the morning, according to the clock on her nightstand. At first she thought it might be the wind rattling a poorly closed window, but soon she recognized the irregular rhythm of footsteps above her head. After 2 months in the mansion, Eleanor had learned to distinguish every creak, every sound the old structure produced. But this was different. Someone was walking in the attic, a space Mrs. Holloway had mentioned was closed since time immemorial. Curiosity prevailed over prudence. Wrapped in her silk robe, Eleanor ventured down the dimly moonlit corridor. The stairs leading to the 3rd floor creaked beneath her bare feet, sending small waves of tension up her spine. Upon reaching the top landing, she noticed a sliver of light under a door she had never seen open before. She approached with cautious steps, holding her breath. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil permeated the air. Through the small opening, she glimpsed Harrison with his back to her, standing before an easel. His hands, those hands he normally hid or kept busy to disguise their tremor, held a brush with surprising steadiness, drawing sure lines across a canvas. Eleanor suppressed a gasp of astonishment. The room was filled with paintings, melancholy landscapes, stormy seascapes, portraits of people with intense gazes that seemed to follow you to every corner. All bore the signature HT in one corner, but none resembled the insipid decorative works that adorned the mansion's salons. Without realizing it, she pushed the door slightly, which yielded with a betraying creak. Harrison turned abruptly, dropping his brush. For an instant, his face showed such naked vulnerability that Eleanor felt she was seeing a completely different man. "Eleanor!" He pronounced her name as if it were a word in a foreign language. "What are you doing here?" There was no reproach in his voice, only deep consternation, as if he'd been discovered in a shameful act. "I heard noises," she replied, entering the room completely. "I didn't know you painted." Harrison retrieved the fallen brush, meticulously cleaning it with a cloth stained with colors. "No one knows," he said finally. "It's not appropriate for someone in my position." Eleanor approached the canvas he was working on, a sunrise over the sea with copper and golden tones that perfectly captured that magical moment between night and day. "It's beautiful," she murmured, genuinely impressed. "Why hide it?" He sketched a bitter smile. "My father used to say art was for dreamers and the useless. The Thornfields build empires, not castles in the air," he recited, with a tone suggesting years of repetition. "When I was 16, he found my drawings and burned them all. He sent me to study economics and business the very next day." Eleanor observed the dozens of works that lined the walls and were stacked in corners. Some seemed years old, others were clearly recent. "But you never stopped painting." "It's the only thing that calms the tremor," he confessed, showing her his now steady hands. "The doctors say it's a nervous condition, but when I paint, it disappears." That moment marked the first significant obstacle in Eleanor's path. How to approach someone who had built such high walls around his true personality. How to extend a bridge to a man who had learned to live in the shadows, even within his own home. "May I come watch you paint again?" she asked, surprising herself with the request. Harrison looked at her for a long time, as if evaluating whether he could trust her with his most precious secret. "If you wish," he finally responded, "but no one else must know." As she descended the stairs to return to her room, Eleanor realized that for the first time since the wedding, she felt something akin to hope. She had discovered a crack in the perfect facade of Harrison Thornfield, and through it had glimpsed a man very different from the one she thought she'd known. The next morning at breakfast, they maintained the same distant courtesy as always. No one observing them could have guessed that something fundamental had changed between them. But when their gazes briefly met over their coffee cups, they shared the secret knowledge that, for the first time, they had seen something real in each other. The third month of marriage coincided with the arrival of the first spring buds and a subtle change in the dynamics of Thornfield Manor. Eleanor had begun working in the abandoned garden with the occasional guidance of Giles, a 70-year-old man whose gnarled hands held the wisdom of decades among plants and flowers. That afternoon, while pulling weeds around a rose bush that seemed on the brink of death, Eleanor reflected on how her life had converted into a series of small rituals: mornings in the garden, afternoons in the library discovering forgotten tomes, and some nights when insomnia visited, silent incursions to the attic where Harrison painted by the light of old lamps. "That rose bush can be saved," said a voice behind her, startling her. Harrison observed her work from the path, hands in his trouser pockets. It was the first time she had seen him in the garden in full daylight. "Giles says it needs special care," Eleanor replied, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Apparently it's an uncommon variety your mother particularly treasured." "Rosa alba maxima," Harrison nodded. "It blooms once a year, with white petals that gradually turn pink at the edges. My mother said it was like life itself, beginning with purity and becoming tinged with experiences." Eleanor looked at him with surprise. It was the longest and most personal conversation they had had outside the attic. "Do you think I'll succeed in making it bloom again?" she asked, pointing to the apparently desolate bush. Harrison approached, crouching beside her to examine the plant. For a moment, they were so close that Eleanor could detect the sandalwood scent of his aftershave, mixed with the earthier smell of paints that always seemed to permeate his skin. "It has good roots," he said finally. "Sometimes, that's all you need to be reborn." Their gazes met, and for a fleeting instant Eleanor thought she saw something more in those amber eyes, a flash of admiration, perhaps even hope. That night, while preparing for bed, she found a small sketch on her vanity. Herself, kneeling beside the rose bush, with sunlight illuminating her hair. It was a quick drawing, but surprisingly expressive, capturing not just her image but also a certain determination in her face that she didn't even know she showed. Eleanor held the drawing between her fingers, feeling a strange warmth spreading through her chest. This silent gesture meant more than any words they had exchanged until then. The next morning, before going down to breakfast, she left a cup of tea by the attic door with a simple note: "For nights of creative insomnia." She didn't mention the drawing, but knew he would understand the message. Thus began a peculiar exchange between them, small gestures that spoke more than 1,000 formal conversations. He would leave sketches in places he knew she would find them. She would respond with freshly cut flowers in his studio or art books she unearthed from the library. One day, during the weekly dinner with Harrison's business partners, Eleanor observed how one of them, a corpulent man named Blackwood, spoke disparagingly about the uselessness of the arts in modern times. "Investments in culture are money thrown away," Blackwood declared, cutting his steak with brusque gestures. "Businessmen like us, Thornfield, know that the only thing that really matters are the numbers on the final balance." Eleanor felt her jaw tense. She looked at Harrison, expecting to see the mask of the ruthless businessman everyone knew. To her surprise, she saw a flash of something different in his eyes. "You might be surprised to know, Blackwood," Harrison responded with measured voice, "that some of history's most brilliant business minds had deep connections with art. Leonardo da Vinci was both inventor and artist, and if I'm not mistaken, your own daughter studies music, doesn't she? Blackwood visibly flushed, while the other diners exchanged surprised glances. It was unusual for Harrison to contradict someone so directly at these social events. Later, when the guests had departed, Eleanor found Harrison in the library, serving himself a cognac. "Thank you," she said simply. He looked at her over the rim of his glass, with an expression that mixed curiosity and something deeper. "What are you thanking me for?" "For defending art tonight. I know how much it cost you." Harrison took a sip of his drink, contemplating the fire crackling in the fireplace. "Perhaps I'm learning that some things are worth defending, even when it's uncomfortable," he replied, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about art. That night, Eleanor understood that the first wall had begun to fall between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning, mutual respect, and the recognition that perhaps, just maybe, they had misjudged the potential of their marital arrangement. What neither could imagine was that fate would soon test this fragile connection in ways they never would have anticipated. The 5th month of marriage coincided with the arrival of summer and its unpredictable storms. The garden that Eleanor had rescued with such care now bloomed with vibrant colors, transforming the previously somber mansion into a place that was beginning to feel like a home. That afternoon, while dark clouds gathered on the horizon, Eleanor was reviewing correspondence at the small desk she had claimed as her own in a corner of the library. Among bills and invitations to social events that didn't interest her, she found an envelope addressed to Harrison, bearing the seal of a medical clinic. Normally, she would have left the letter with the rest of her husband's mail, but something about the sender seemed familiar. Neurology Institute of New England read the letterhead. Eleanor recalled fragments of a conversation overheard weeks ago between Harrison and his lawyer, speaking in low voices about experimental treatments and progression of symptoms. The tremor in Harrison's hands, his insistence on hiding it, the paintings he only created at night, when no one could see him vulnerable. Lightning illuminated the library, followed by the rumble of thunder. The storm had arrived, both outside and within Eleanor. She left the unopened letter on Harrison's pile of correspondence and stepped onto the veranda, where the wind was already violently agitating the trees. The first raindrops, thick and heavy, began to strike the marble floor. "It's going to be a strong storm," said Harrison's voice behind her. He didn't seem surprised to find her there, as if he had expected that they would both seek the same refuge to contemplate nature's fury. "I've always liked storms," Eleanor confessed without turning. "My mother hated them, said they were omens of misfortune, but I've always felt there is something purifying about them." Harrison positioned himself beside her, both protected by the ample roof of the veranda, while the rain increased, forming a curtain of water before them. "I like them too," he said, and there was an almost youthful note in his voice. "As a child, I used to escape to watch them from the West Tower. My governess would punish me afterward, but it was worth it." Eleanor looked at him sideways, discovering a relaxed expression he rarely showed. "Harrison," she began, knowing that perhaps there would be no better moment than this, with the storm isolating them from the world. "What's really happening with you? The tremor in your hands. It's more than nervousness, isn't it?" Harrison's expression hardened instantly. For a moment, Eleanor feared she had destroyed the fragile bridge they had been building for months. "Have you been snooping through my affairs?" he asked with an icy voice. "No," she replied firmly. "I've been living with you, observing, worrying." The last word seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. When had she begun to genuinely care about him? A new lightning flash illuminated his face, revealing an internal struggle that Eleanor had never witnessed before. "Parkinson's disease," Harrison finally said, his voice so low it was barely audible above the sound of the rain. "Early stage, but progressive. The doctors say I'll eventually lose control not just of my hands, but of other motor functions as well." Eleanor felt as if something cold had settled in her chest. "How long have you known?" 3 years, right before my board of directors began suggesting it was time to settle down." His laugh lacked humor. What they really meant was that I needed an heir before it was too late, or worse yet, before my condition became public and the company's shares plummeted. "And me? Was I just a convenient solution to your problem?" The question escaped Eleanor's lips before she could contain it. Harrison looked her directly in the eyes for the first time in this conversation. At first, yes, he admitted with brutal honesty. I needed a young wife from a good family, even if it was a ruined one. Your father needed money. It was practical. Eleanor felt something breaking inside her, though she had suspected the truth for some time. And now, she surprised herself by asking the question she didn't know she needed to ask. Harrison extended his trembling hand to her, a vulnerable gesture that completely contradicted the calculating businessman the world knew. Now I'm not sure of anything, except that I no longer see you as part of a deal, he confessed. And that terrifies me more than the disease. Eleanor looked at that extended hand, aware that she was at a crossroads. She could step back, protect herself, maintain the defenses she had built since her wedding day, or she could take a step toward the unknown, toward a connection neither of them had anticipated. She made her decision. She placed her hand over Harrison's, feeling the slight tremor beneath her palm. Then I'll have to be brave for both of us, she said with a faint smile. As the storm lashed the garden she had resurrected with such effort, Eleanor understood that she had just made the most difficult and potentially transformative decision of her life, choosing the possibility of love over the safety of indifference. What neither could foresee was that this decision would trigger events that would test their newly discovered connection in ways they never would have imagined. A beach house. Eleanor looked at Harrison with genuine surprise as he unfolded the plans on the breakfast table. I didn't know you had properties on the coast. It was a radiant July morning, and the aroma of freshly made coffee permeated the dining room. During the last few weeks since that stormy afternoon, a new comfort had settled between them, allowing them to share breakfast with conversations that went beyond formal courtesy. Actually, it's the only property I inherited from my mother, Harrison explained, pointing to the location on a small map. An old lighthouse converted into a house in a fishing village in Maine that has practically disappeared from tourist maps. I spent every summer there until I was 14. His fingers, which were notably trembling that morning, traced the architectural drawing with nostalgia. Eleanor noticed how he tried to disguise the tremor by clenching his fist when he thought she wasn't watching. Have you thought about going back? She asked carefully, pouring him more coffee. I never found a reason to, he replied, looking up. Until now. The proposal hung between them. Not a traditional honeymoon they never had, but a journey into Harrison's past, an invitation to know a part of him few had seen. 3 days later, Harrison's luxury car was winding along narrow coastal roads. The landscape had gradually changed. The extensive plains had given way to rolling hills, and finally to steep cliffs where the sea broke with foamy fury. Eleanor watched through the window, absorbing every detail of the journey. Unlike the rigid formality of the mansion, here Harrison seemed to visibly relax with each mile that took them away from the city. He even drove with the windows down, allowing the sea breeze to tousle his normally impeccable hair. There it is, he finally announced, pointing to a white structure silhouetted against the intense blue sky. The lighthouse rose on a rocky promontory, with its circular tower rising above a 2-story house built at its base. The whitewashed walls gleamed in the afternoon sun, and a small wild garden of lavender and rosemary surrounded the property, swayed by the constant sea breeze. It's perfect, Eleanor murmured, feeling an unexpected emotion at the sight of this place that seemed to exist outside of time. Inside, the house was a surprising mix of past and present. The polished wooden floors, exposed beams, and arched windows spoke of its century-old history. But someone had modernized the kitchen and bathrooms with discreet touches that didn't clash with the character of the place. I hired a local caretaker to keep it habitable, Harrison explained as he opened windows to let in the sea breeze, though it's been years since I spent more than a day here. That night, they dined on the terrace with an uninterrupted view of the ocean. Stars were beginning to appear in a sky transitioning from orange to deep indigo, and the constant sound of waves breaking against the rocks created a hypnotic melody. This place is very different from you, Eleanor observed, savoring a local wine Harrison had discovered in the cellar. Or perhaps I should say, different from the Harrison Thornfield everyone knows. He smiled slightly, turning his glass between fingers that, for the first time in a long time, seemed almost stable. Perhaps this place is more me than any boardroom or social event, he replied, with a sincerity that still felt new between them. My mother used to say this is where the Thornfields truly breathe, away from expectations and appearances. Do you miss her? Eleanor asked softly. Every day, Harrison looked toward the horizon where sky and sea merged in darkness. She died when I was 15. Cancer. My father never really recovered. He became harder, more ruthless, as if he wanted to extinguish any trace of vulnerability that might remind him of what he had lost. And you became what he expected, Eleanor completed, finally understanding pieces of the puzzle that was her husband. It was easier than fighting, or so I believed then. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable but contemplative. Eleanor felt that for the first time they were having a completely honest conversation, without the layers of courtesy and distance that had defined their relationship until then. You know, I never asked why you agreed to marry me, Harrison said suddenly. I understand why your father arranged it, but you could have refused. You were young, beautiful. You had options. Eleanor considered the question as she listened to the constant rhythm of the waves. At first it was for my family, she admitted. My father talked about bankruptcy, about losing everything. He presented the marriage as the only solution. She paused, remembering those days of anguish and resignation. But there was something more, she continued, surprising herself with her honesty. All my life I felt invisible, the perfect daughter who did what was expected of her. I never made a really important decision for myself. Marrying you was, ironically, the first time I felt I was choosing my destiny, even if it was an imposed destiny. Harrison watched her with an intensity that made Eleanor feel truly seen, perhaps for the first time. You're not invisible, Eleanor, he said in a voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of the sea. You never were. That night, as Eleanor prepared for sleep in the room Harrison had assigned her, maintaining the same physical distance they had observed in the mansion, an unexpected storm broke over the coast. The wind howled around the lighthouse, and lightning intermittently illuminated the room through the half-open curtains. Eleanor found herself smiling in the darkness. Storms had always brought her clarity, and this one was no different. Amidst the roar of the elements, she understood that something extraordinary was happening. She was falling in love with the man she had married out of obligation. What she didn't know was that the real storm was only beginning, and that the most painful revelations were yet to come. The 7th day at the lighthouse house dawned with a crystalline clarity after 3 days of uninterrupted storm. Eleanor awoke to the sound of seagulls and the salty aroma that penetrated through the half-open window. She felt different, as if the storm had carried away not just the clouds, but also the last reservations she maintained in her heart. She found Harrison in the kitchen, preparing coffee with carefully measured movements to compensate for the tremor in his hands, which seemed especially pronounced that morning. "Good morning," she greeted, resisting the impulse to help him. She had learned that Harrison valued his independence, especially on bad days. "The sea is extraordinarily calm after the storm," he commented, pointing toward the window where the ocean could be seen in perfect calm, like an apology for his own agitated condition. "I thought we might go down to the beach. There's a small cove accessible by a path that only locals know." The proposal was an invitation not just to a physical place, but to greater intimacy. Eleanor understood this perfectly. The path turned out to be a narrow trail that serpentined down the cliff, partially hidden by coastal vegetation. Harrison walked in front, occasionally extending his hand to help her on the more difficult stretches. Eleanor noticed that he didn't try to hide the tremor when she took his hand. It was a small but significant act of trust. The cove was a hidden paradise, a small beach of golden sand enclosed by rock formations that protected it from the wind. The water, an impossibly turquoise blue, lapped gently at the shore. "I used to come here to escape summer lessons," Harrison confessed as they sat on the sand. "My tutor never discovered this place." Eleanor removed her sandals, sinking her feet into the warm sand. It must have been wonderful growing up with this refuge. It was. Nostalgia tinged his voice. But it also fed my tendency to escape, to create separate spaces for different parts of myself. The attic with my paintings, this cove with my thoughts, always divided. "And now?" Eleanor asked, looking at him directly. Harrison held her gaze, and for the first time there was no barrier in his eyes. "Now I want to try to be one person, complete, true." He paused, as if gathering courage. "And I want you to know him." The moment was charged with meaning. Eleanor felt they were on the verge of something transcendental, a point of no return in their relationship. "Harrison, I also want—" Her words were interrupted by the sound of a phone. Harrison took his mobile from his pocket with an apologetic expression, but upon seeing the screen his face changed. "I have to take this," he said, rising and moving a few steps away. Eleanor observed how his body language transformed as he spoke. The tension returned to his shoulders. His posture became more rigid. The business Harrison was back, and the contrast with the man who had been at her side minutes before was painful to witness. The call continued for almost 20 minutes. When he finally returned, the shadow that Eleanor already knew well had settled back into his gaze. "We have to return to the city," he announced in a neutral voice. "A situation has arisen at the company that requires my immediate presence." "Something serious?" she asked, trying to hide her disappointment. "You could say that." His response was evasive. "I'll explain on the way." But he didn't. The return journey passed mostly in silence, with Harrison responding to messages and making brief calls that he deliberately kept cryptic. Eleanor felt how the wall that had cost them so much to tear down was being rebuilt between them, brick by brick. Upon arriving at the mansion, an unpleasant surprise awaited them. The black Mercedes of Maxwell Bennett, Harrison's personal lawyer, was parked at the entrance, and beside it, to Eleanor's dismay, her father's Audi. "What is my father doing here?" she asked, feeling a sudden apprehension. Harrison turned off the engine and turned to her with a grave expression. "Eleanor, there's something you should know. The call I received, it was from private investigators I hired months ago." Eleanor's heart accelerated. "Investigators for what? I don't understand." "Your family isn't ruined, Eleanor. They never were." The words fell like stones between them. "Your father falsified financial documents to make it appear they were on the brink of bankruptcy, all to pressure you into accepting this marriage." Eleanor felt the ground vanishing beneath her feet. The implications of what Harrison was saying were too enormous to process immediately. How do you know?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. "I always investigate thoroughly before doing business with someone," Harrison responded, and there was a coldness in his tone that he hadn't used with her in months, even when that business is a marriage. The word business hit Eleanor like a slap. After all they had shared, is this how he viewed their union? "So you knew from the beginning." The tears she had never shed for this marriage were beginning to form now. "All this time you knew my father had deceived me into marrying you." Harrison held her gaze, but something in his eyes wavered. "I suspected. I needed concrete proof before acting. And why did you proceed with the wedding if you knew it was a farce?" The question arose amid tears of anger and confusion. For a moment, it seemed Harrison would evade the question. But then something in his expression changed. "Because I saw you, Eleanor, really saw you. At the engagement party, while everyone was toasting our future, I observed you move away to the garden. You found a withered orchid in a forgotten corner. Instead of ignoring it, you knelt in your designer dress and began removing its dry leaves, straightening it. You cared for something everyone had discarded as lost." Eleanor remembered that moment. It had been an instinctive act, a brief escape from the falsity of the event. "In that instant I knew I wanted to truly know you, beyond the agreement." Harrison's voice softened. "And when I confirmed my suspicions about your father, I decided to proceed anyway. I wanted to give you time, to see if we could build something real from a false beginning." Eleanor felt a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. Betrayal by her father, confusion at Harrison's duplicity, and at the deepest level, a lacerating pain because just when she had begun to open up, to trust, to feel, everything turned out to be built on lies. "I need to speak with my father," she said finally, opening the car door. "Alone?" Harrison nodded, respecting her request. "I'll be in my study when you're ready to talk." As she walked toward the mansion where her father awaited her, Eleanor felt she had reached a definitive crossroads. The revelations of this day would change the course of her marriage forever. The only question was, would they destroy it completely, or create the opportunity for something authentic, built this time on truth? "You've always been too idealistic, Eleanor. The world doesn't operate on the romantic principles from your books." Whitaker Mercer, seated in one of the armchairs in the main salon, maintained the same arrogant posture that Eleanor remembered from her childhood. His immaculate suit and perfect haircut contrasted with the emotional chaos he had unleashed. Idealistic? Is that what you call expecting honesty from my own father? Eleanor remained standing, refusing to sit, as if doing so would imply some kind of concession. You made me believe we were ruined, that marriage to Harrison was our only salvation. Whitaker made a dismissive gesture with his hand. I improved your life. Any woman in your position would be grateful for such an advantageous marriage. You lied to me. Eleanor's voice broke for the first time. You robbed me of the possibility to choose. Her father rose, approaching the window that overlooked the garden she had restored with such effort over the last few months. Look around you, Eleanor. This mansion, the jewels you wear, the social position you've acquired. Does it really seem such a terrible sacrifice? Eleanor observed her father with new eyes. She had always seen him as a figure of unquestionable authority, a man whose decisions, though strict, were motivated by family welfare. Now she saw something different. Unbridled ambition, a willingness to sacrifice his own daughter for personal gain. Why? She finally asked. If we weren't bankrupt, why force me into this marriage? Whitaker turned to her, and for an instant Eleanor thought she glimpsed a flash of shame in his eyes, quickly replaced by his habitual coldness. Thornfield and I had pending matters from decades ago. This marriage settled old debts and opened new opportunities. It was an elegant solution for everyone. For everyone except me? The incredulity tinged every word from Eleanor. What kind of debts could justify using your daughter as a bargaining chip? I don't expect you to understand now, Whitaker responded with impatience. Someday, when you have more experience in how the world really works, you'll thank me. Eleanor shook her head, feeling a mixture of pain and clarity. This man had controlled every aspect of her life since she could remember, molding her according to his expectations, treating her as an extension of himself instead of as a person with her own desires and rights. I want you to leave, she said, with a calmness that surprised even herself, and I don't want to see you again until I'm ready to speak with you again, if I ever am. Whitaker seemed genuinely surprised for the first time in the conversation. You can't speak to me like that, I'm your father, and I am an adult woman who has just discovered she's been living a lie. Eleanor pointed toward the door. Please, leave now. After a tense silence, Whitaker collected his coat and headed for the exit, pausing briefly beside her. When this fit of rebellion passes, we'll talk. Harrison perfectly understands how these agreements work. Don't ruin what we've built for you with unnecessary sentimentality. When the door closed behind him, Eleanor finally allowed herself to crumble. The tears she had contained throughout the conversation flowed freely as she slid to the floor, leaning against the wall. The pain was almost physical, as if something had irreparably broken inside her. She didn't know how long she remained like this, but eventually she perceived a silent presence. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, observed her from the threshold with a compassionate expression. The previous Mrs. Thornfield, Master Harrison's mother, also cried like this sometimes, said the elderly woman, approaching with cautious steps. She said tears cleanse the soul as rain cleanses the garden. Eleanor tried to compose herself, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. Did you know her well? She asked, accepting the handkerchief Mrs. Holloway offered. I served in this house for 40 years, child. The elderly woman sat in the nearest armchair, with a familiarity she never would have permitted herself under normal circumstances. Mrs. Vivian was like you in many ways, married young to a man who at first seemed unreachable. Were they happy? The question escaped Eleanor's lips before she could contain it. Mrs. Holloway sketched a nostalgic smile. They learned to be. It wasn't easy, but they found their way to each other. She made a significant pause. As you and the master were beginning to do. Eleanor looked at her with surprise. Was it so evident? To those who know how to look, yes. Mrs. Holloway rose with difficulty. Master Harrison is in his study. He hasn't touched the dinner I brought him, nor has he allowed Mr. Bennet to leave. They're discussing something important. The mention of the lawyer reminded Eleanor that this situation went beyond her hurt feelings. There were legal, financial, and social implications she would have to face. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway, she said, rising and drying her last tears. I think I need to speak with my husband. Harrison's study was in the west wing of the mansion, a masculine sanctuary of dark wood and leather that Eleanor rarely visited. As she approached, she heard raised voices on the other side of the heavy door. Absolutely unacceptable, Harrison. The agreement was clear. Maxwell's voice sounded agitated. Whitaker fulfilled his part by delivering what you wanted. If you now take legal measures against him— What I wanted was justice, not to deceive an innocent young woman, Harrison interrupted, with a harshness Eleanor had never heard from him. Prepare the documents I asked for, Maxwell. This discussion is over. Eleanor hesitated an instant before knocking. Harrison's words about justice resonated in her mind, adding new questions to the many that already tormented her. Finally, she knocked on the door decisively. The immediate silence on the other side was revealing. After a few seconds, Harrison's voice, now composed again, responded, "Come in." Upon entering, she found both men in an evident defensive position. Maxwell was hastily collecting papers, while Harrison remained standing by the window, his rigid posture betraying the tension he tried to hide. "Eleanor," he greeted formally. Maxwell was just leaving. The lawyer nodded nervously, avoiding looking at her directly as he collected his briefcase. "Mrs. Thornfield, with your permission." When they were alone, the silence thickened between them like fog on a cold dawn. Eleanor advanced to the center of the room, aware that the words they exchanged now would define the future of their relationship. "My father has gone," she said finally, "and I'm afraid you owe me some explanations, Harrison. What pending matters were there between you that justified this arrangement?" Harrison looked at her for a long time, as if evaluating how much he could or should reveal. The tremor in his hands was more pronounced than ever, as he poured himself a whiskey he didn't drink. "Your father ruined mine 25 years ago," he finally responded. "A joint business that Whitaker deliberately sabotaged to keep the more lucrative part. My father couldn't bear the humiliation and betrayal from someone he considered his friend. He committed suicide 3 months later." The revelation hit Eleanor like an icy wave. She had never heard this story, this dark connection between the families. "And our marriage was— what? A revenge?" Her voice trembled almost as much as Harrison's hands. "At the beginning, perhaps," he admitted, and there was a brutal honesty in his tone. "I wanted Whitaker to feel what it's like to see someone you love in the hands of someone you consider your enemy." Eleanor felt the floor moving beneath her feet. "So everything that happened between us was part of your plan to avenge yourself on my father?" Harrison took a step toward her, but stopped when he saw Eleanor instinctively back away. "No." The word sounded firm, almost desperate. "What happened between us these months, that was real, Eleanor. More real than anything else in my life for a long time." Eleanor wanted to believe him. A part of her, the one that had flourished during the last few months under his attention and care, yearned to accept those words. But another part, the one that had just discovered a life built on lies, couldn't avoid distrust. "How can I believe you? How can I know this isn't just another manipulation?" Harrison seemed to age 10 years before her eyes. With tired movements, he opened a drawer in his desk and extracted an envelope that he extended to her. "Because I'm giving you your freedom. Here are the documents to annul our marriage, with terms that guarantee you economic independence. You can leave tomorrow if that's what you wish." Eleanor took the envelope with trembling hands, unable to open it. The magnitude of what was happening, of the decisions she had to make, completely overwhelmed her. "I need time," she finally managed to say, "to think, to understand all this." Harrison nodded, maintaining the distance she had imposed. "Take all the time you need. The Lighthouse House is at your disposal if you want to get away from here." "From me?" In that moment, looking at the man who had begun as her captor and had become something more, Eleanor understood that she was at the lowest point of her life. Everything she had believed, everything she thought she knew about herself and her family, had revealed itself as an elaborate lie. And yet, amid this paralyzing pain, she also felt something unexpected, a strange sensation of freedom. For the first time, she would have to make a completely personal decision, without manipulations or others' expectations. As she left the study with the envelope in hand, she knew the path ahead would be painful, but also that she was finally walking under her own volition. The Lighthouse House received Eleanor with the same aroma of salt and wood she remembered, but this time, without Harrison's presence, the place had a melancholy air that resonated with her state of mind. She had decided to accept the offer to distance herself, desperately needing space to think clearly. The ocean stretched infinitely before her, as she unpacked the small suitcase she had brought. Just the essentials, some clothes, a notebook to write in, and the envelope with the annulment documents she still hadn't had the courage to open. The first days passed in a kind of emotional lethargy. Eleanor spent hours sitting on the veranda, watching the waves break against the rocks, finding in their constant rhythm a strange consolation. At night, the beam of light from the lighthouse, which continued to function automatically, swept the darkness of the ocean, reminding her that even in the darkest night, there exists something that guides the lost. By the third day, the initial paralysis began to yield, giving way to an anger she didn't know she harbored inside. Anger toward her father for his manipulation, toward Harrison for his initial motives, but above all toward herself for having been so easily molded by others' expectations. "Who am I really?" she asked aloud to the empty room, while the storm that had been brewing all day finally broke outside. The roar of thunder seemed to answer her, pushing her to an action she had been postponing. With trembling fingers, she finally opened the envelope Harrison had given her. The documents were as generous as he had promised. They not only granted her the annulment of the marriage without any stain on her reputation, citing medical reasons that didn't harm her, but also established a substantial trust fund in her name, sufficient to guarantee her economic independence for life. What surprised her most, however, was finding at the end a handwritten note from Harrison, his slightly trembling letters revealing the effort it had cost him to write it. "Eleanor, these documents are your right, not a wish. If you decide to use them, I will understand completely. But before you make your final decision, there is something else you should know. I never intended to fall in love with you. It was the most unexpected and beautiful mistake of my life. Whatever happens, I want you to know that the moments we shared in the garden in the attic in this house were the most real thing I have experienced in decades. Always yours, Harrison." The tears Eleanor had been holding back for days finally flowed freely. She cried for the naive young woman she had been, for the marriage based on deceptions, for the authentic feelings that had blossomed in contaminated soil. When dawn broke, she felt strangely light, as if the tears had washed something heavy from her interior. She took the notebook she had brought and began to write, not with a defined purpose, but as a way to order her thoughts. She wrote about her privileged but lonely childhood, about the constant sensation of being a disappointment to her father, who had always wanted a son, about how she had learned to be invisible, to occupy the least space possible, to always please to avoid conflicts. She wrote about her wedding day, about the dress that weighed like a tombstone, about the first months of marriage, the discovery of the secret studio, the gradual transformation of the abandoned garden, about the shared storms and the revelations at the lighthouse house. When she finished, the sun was beginning to set, tinging the horizon with orange and purple tones. Eleanor reread what she had written, surprised to discover that, without intending to, she had traced the map of her own transformation. Who was Eleanor Mercer Thornfield really? No longer the docile and resigned young woman from her wedding day, nor the decorative wife society expected. Perhaps she still didn't know with certainty, but for the first time, she felt the pressing desire to find out. That night, as a gentle rain pattered against the windows, Eleanor made an important decision. She wouldn't sign the annulment papers, at least not yet, not out of loyalty to a marriage based on lies, but because fleeing now would be another way of allowing others to define her story. She needed to confront Harrison, not from the initial pain and confusion, but from this new clarity. She needed truths, all of them, as painful as they might be. And then, only then, would she decide her path with full awareness. At dawn on the 7th day, while preparing coffee in the small kitchen, she heard the sound of an approaching motor. She wasn't expecting visitors. She had been clear in her desire for solitude. For a moment she feared it might be her father, attempting another manipulation. But looking through the window, she saw Mrs. Holloway's unmistakable black car. The elderly woman descended from the vehicle with careful movements, helped by the driver. She carried a package wrapped in brown paper under her arm. "Mrs. Holloway," Eleanor greeted, coming out to receive her. "Has something happened?" The woman looked at her with a mixture of concern and determination. "The master doesn't know I'm here," she said without preamble, "and he would probably dismiss me if he knew. But there are things you need to know, things he will never tell you because he believes he's protecting you by concealing them." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. "Please, come in." At the kitchen table, Mrs. Holloway unwrapped the package, revealing an old photo album and several newspaper clippings yellowed by time. "When your father came to the mansion that day, I recognized his face, though I had never seen him in person," Mrs. Holloway began, opening the album to a photograph showing two smiling young men in university attire. "This is Master Arthur, Harrison's father, and this," she pointed to the other young man, "is Whittaker Mercer, your father." Eleanor observed the photograph with fascination. Her father seemed like another person, carefree with a genuine smile she had never seen on him. "They were like brothers," Mrs. Holloway continued, "inseparable from university until they founded the company together. Master Arthur had the talent and the ideas. Your father had the contacts and the ambition." She slowly turned the pages of the album, showing the chronology of a friendship that would eventually become a business partnership. "What Harrison doesn't know, what no one knows except me, is that there was more than business between the two families." Mrs. Holloway extracted a loose photograph, hidden between the pages of the album. It showed a beautiful woman with dark hair and luminous eyes, surprisingly similar to Eleanor's. "Vivian Thornfield, Harrison's mother," Mrs. Holloway explained. "Before marrying Master Arthur, she was engaged to your father, an engagement that Whittaker abruptly broke when he met the heiress of the Lamberts, your mother." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. Her father had been engaged to Harrison's mother. Mrs. Vivian eventually sincerely fell in love with Master Arthur, but your father never really got over it. The business betrayal, the sabotage that Harrison told you about. It was personal, a revenge for the happiness Vivian found with Arthur. The pieces were beginning to fit together in Eleanor's mind, forming a tragic pattern of love, betrayal, and revenge spanning decades. "And Harrison? Does he know about the broken engagement?" Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "Mrs. Vivian never wanted him to know. She feared the knowledge would only feed more hatred between the families, but I believe you need to understand the complete story to be able to decide your future." Eleanor spent the following hours absorbing every detail Mrs. Holloway shared. How Whittaker had gradually manipulated the joint business, how he had spread rumors that undermined investors' confidence in Arthur, how he had finally orchestrated his financial and social downfall. "Master Arthur's suicide destroyed the family," Mrs. Holloway concluded with a broken voice. "Harrison was only 17. Overnight he had to become the man of the house, care for his sick mother, and rebuild the family empire from the ashes. He hardened, became as you know him now, or as you knew him at the beginning." "And why are you telling me all this now?" Eleanor asked, overwhelmed by the revelations. The elderly woman covered Eleanor's hands with her own, wrinkled by time. "Because I've seen how you look at each other. I saw the same sparkle in your eyes that I saw in Mrs. Vivian's when she truly fell in love with Master Arthur. And because I believe this cycle of pain must end." As Mrs. Holloway prepared to depart, leaving the album with Eleanor, "It belongs more to you now than to anyone," the young woman felt she finally had all the pieces of the puzzle. The complete story was more tragic and complex than she had imagined, but also more human. That night, under the intermittent light of the lighthouse, Eleanor made her second important decision. She would return to Thornfield Manor. Not to sign the annulment papers, nor to immediately forgive the lies, but to confront the past and, perhaps, build a future that would break the cycle of revenge and pain that had united and separated both families for too long. Thornfield Manor seemed different when Eleanor returned after 9 days of absence. It wasn't a physical change, the same imposing walls, the same ornamental friezes on the eaves, but something more subtle, as if the place reflected the interior transformation she herself had experienced. Mrs. Holloway received her at the entrance with a mixture of relief and concern in her wrinkled face. "The master is in the attic," she informed without need for questions. "He hasn't come out much since you left." Eleanor nodded, silently thanking the housekeeper for her discretion. During the return journey, she had mentally rehearsed 1,000 possible conversations with Harrison, but now that she was here, all the carefully prepared words vanished. She slowly climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, each step resonating with the weight of past and future decisions. The studio door was ajar, and through the gap filtered the smell of turpentine and the irregular sound of brushstrokes on canvas. She entered without announcing herself, as on that first night months ago. Harrison had his back to her, working frenetically on a large format canvas. It wasn't his usual style of contemplative landscapes. This painting seemed to explode with turbulent colors and violent strokes that conveyed a raw emotion Eleanor had never seen in his work. "You've come back," he said without turning, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in days. "How did you know it was me?" Eleanor asked, stopping in the middle of the studio. "Your perfume." Harrison set the brush down in a jar stained with colors. "Jasmine, and something I've never been able to identify." He finally turned to look at her, and Eleanor suppressed a gasp at his appearance. The always impeccable Harrison Thornfield seemed to have aged years in days. An incipient beard covered his chin, and deep shadows darkened his eyes. His hands visibly trembled, without any attempt to hide it. "I didn't expect to see you so soon," he admitted. "Or at all, to be honest." Eleanor advanced a few more steps, still maintaining a certain physical distance between them. "I didn't expect to return like this either," she responded with sincerity. "But there are things I need to understand before making any decision." Harrison nodded, indicating a small, worn sofa in a corner of the studio, the only furniture besides the easel and a stool. They sat, maintaining a prudent space between them. "Mrs. Holloway told me everything," Eleanor began, carefully observing his reaction. "About our parents, about Vivian and Whitaker." A spark of surprise followed by confusion crossed Harrison's face. "Vivian and Whitaker? My mother and your father, I don't understand." Eleanor understood that Mrs. Holloway had told the truth. Harrison was unaware of the romantic connection that had existed between their families before the business conflict. With a soft but firm voice, she told him everything she had learned. The broken engagement, the resentment that had poisoned the friendship and business, the personal revenge disguised as business strategy. Harrison listened with growing intensity, his face transforming from initial incredulity to painful understanding. "That would explain so many things," he murmured when Eleanor finished her account. "The sadness I sometimes saw in my mother's eyes when your father was mentioned. The disproportionate, almost obsessive hatred that Whitaker showed toward my father, even in public." He rose abruptly, walking to the window to look at the garden Eleanor had transformed over the last few months. "All my life, I believed I understood what had happened," he continued, more to himself than to her. "My father, the creative idealist, betrayed by the astute businessman. It was a simple, clear narrative. It gave me a purpose, a mission, to restore the family honor, to prove that the Thornfields couldn't be destroyed." He turned to look at her, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that Eleanor had never seen. "And then, when I learned of my disease, when the doctors told me it was progressive, that purpose became more urgent. I needed to close the circle before losing the ability to do so. And I was the final piece," Eleanor completed, feeling a painful clarity. "Whitaker's daughter given in marriage to Arthur's son, a poetic justice." Harrison didn't deny it, he couldn't. "At first, yes," he admitted, and his honesty was like a sharp but necessary knife. "I wanted Whitaker to feel what it was like to hand over something precious to someone he considered his enemy. I wanted him to suffer, knowing his daughter was in my hands." Eleanor closed her eyes, assimilating the pain of those words. For a moment, silence filled the studio, so dense it seemed to have its own weight. "And afterward?" she finally asked, opening her eyes to face whatever truth might come. Harrison approached slowly, not toward her, but toward the canvas he had been working on. He turned it so Eleanor could see it for the first time. The painting took her breath away. It was her, in the mansion's garden, kneeling among the flowers she had resurrected with such care. But it wasn't a simple, realistic portrait. Harrison had captured something deeper, an inner light, a quiet but unbreakable strength that emanated from each brushstroke. It was as if he had painted not just her physical appearance, but her essence. "Afterward, I truly saw you," Harrison said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not as Whitaker's daughter, not as a piece in a revenge game, but as Eleanor, a woman who finds beauty where others see only decay, who cares for what everyone has abandoned, who looks at storms and sees purification instead of destruction." Eleanor rose, approaching the painting as if drawn by a magnetic force. She saw the dates in one corner, He had begun painting it weeks before the revelation, before her flight to the lighthouse house. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked, brushing the edge of the canvas with her fingers. "Why maintain revenge as motivation when you already felt—" "This?" Harrison passed a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. "Fear," he confessed with devastating simplicity. "Fear that if I told you the truth about my initial intentions, you would hate me. Fear that if I admitted what I was beginning to feel, I would make myself vulnerable again. And then, when the investigators confirmed your father's farce—" "You had to choose," Eleanor completed, finally understanding. "Between your revenge planned for years and what we had begun to build." "It wasn't an easy choice," Harrison admitted. "But when I saw you return from the lighthouse house, devastated by the revelation, I knew I couldn't continue with that farce. I preferred to lose you with honesty than keep you with more lies." Eleanor contemplated the painting again, seeing in it not just how Harrison perceived her, but also the internal conflict he himself had been experiencing. The turbulent colors around the central figure spoke of his own emotional storm, of the clash between the past that had defined him and the future he barely dared to imagine. "We are built on lies, Harrison," she said finally. "Our parents, us, this entire marriage." He nodded, accepting the painful truth of her words. "I know, and I'll completely understand if you decide it's too much to overcome." Eleanor took a step toward him, reducing the physical distance that symbolized the emotional distance between them. "I haven't signed the papers," she said with a clear voice. "Not because I'm not hurt, not because everything is forgiven, but because I believe that maybe we can build something new. Something ours, not defined by our parents or by the past." Harrison looked at her with a mixture of hope and bewilderment. "How? After everything you know?" Eleanor extended her hand, taking Harrison's, feeling the tremor he no longer tried to hide. "With absolute honesty from this moment forward. No secrets, no hidden agendas." She paused, squeezing his hand slightly. "It won't be easy. Trust that has been broken isn't repaired overnight. But I believe that what we discovered in these months, what we felt, deserves a chance." In that moment, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the attic windows, Eleanor felt they were at the lowest point of the arc of their shared story. They had traversed painful revelations, had seen their foundations crumble, but paradoxically, that very destruction had created space for something potentially stronger, more authentic. "I can't promise my disease won't worsen," Harrison said, his voice broken by emotion. "The doctors say that eventually." Eleanor placed a finger on his lips, silencing his fears. "I'm not asking for guarantees about the future, just truth in the present, one day at a time." Harrison nodded slowly, and for the first time since Eleanor had known him, she saw contained tears in his eyes. "One day at a time," he repeated, as if sealing a new pact between them. As the sun set over Thornfield Manor, illuminating for the last time the studio where so many secrets had been revealed, Eleanor understood that they had reached the end of one story, but also perhaps the beginning of another. One written by themselves, free from the shadows of the past that had defined them for so long. The 11th month after the wedding dawned with a different clarity at Thornfield Manor. It wasn't just the golden October light bathing the now exuberant gardens, but a new transparency among its inhabitants that transformed even the darkest corners of the old house. Eleanor awoke to the sound of light rain tapping against her window. She instinctively extended her hand to the other side of the bed, finding it empty but still warm. Harrison had risen early, as he had been doing in recent weeks. Since their conversation in the attic, they had begun a slow but steady process of reconstruction, not just of their relationship, but also of themselves as individuals. To the surprise of both, they had decided to share the master bedroom, not so much for physical intimacy, which they were rediscovering with caution, but for the symbolism of tearing down the last barriers between them. Eleanor dressed in comfortable clothes and went down to the kitchen, where she found a note from Harrison alongside a bunch of freshly cut wildflowers. "In the greenhouse. Come when you wake. I have something to show you." The greenhouse had been their joint project during the last month, a Victorian structure of iron and glass at the north end of the garden that had been abandoned for decades, converted into little more than a repository for rusted tools and broken pots. Harrison had suggested restoring it as a space for winter cultivation, and Eleanor had accepted enthusiastically. seeing in the project a metaphor for what they were trying to do with their marriage. As she approached, she saw Harrison through the newly cleaned glass. He was bent over a work table, concentrating on something she couldn't distinguish from outside. His painter's apron, stained with multiple colors, gave him a curiously youthful appearance. "Good morning," Eleanor greeted as she entered, feeling the pleasant warmth of the interior contrasting with the autumn freshness. Harrison turned with a smile that still had the power to accelerate Eleanor's heart. In these months of rediscovery, she had learned to value these genuine smiles, so different from the formal courtesy that had characterized their first encounters. "I wanted you to be the first to see," he said, stepping aside to reveal what he had been preparing. On the work table, he had arranged dozens of small pots, each containing a different seedling. Beside them, an open notebook showed meticulous sketches of a garden, with notes and observations in the margins. "It's a therapeutic garden," Harrison explained, turning pages of the notebook to show her more details. "I've been researching therapeutic horticulture for patients with neurodegenerative diseases. There are studies suggesting that working with plants can help maintain fine motor coordination and reduce stress that worsens the symptoms." Eleanor traced the careful drawings with her fingers, recognizing Harrison's artistic style, but applied to a completely new purpose. "It's beautiful," she said with sincerity. "When did you start planning it?" "After my last visit to the neurologist," he responded, and Eleanor noticed that he no longer lowered his voice or avoided her gaze when mentioning his disease. "Dr. Camden suggested I seek activities that combine precise movement with creative satisfaction. He mentioned gardening, and I immediately thought of you." "Of us." Eleanor moved closer, examining the small seedlings that were just beginning to show their first true leaves. "What are all these?" "Medicinal and aromatic plants mainly," Harrison explained, indicating each one. "Lavender for stress, rosemary for memory, lemon balm for mood." He paused, carefully taking a pot he had kept separate. "And this one is special." He handed her the pot, where a tiny, barely visible sprout emerged from the dark soil. "Rosa alba maxima," Eleanor recognized, remembering the variety she had tried to save months ago in the main garden. "But how? I thought it hadn't survived in the end." Harrison smiled, and there was an almost childlike pride in his expression. "I kept a cutting before the original rosebush withered completely. I've been trying to root it in secret for weeks. This morning, I finally saw the first sprout." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat at the symbolism of the gesture. The rose his mother had loved, which had seemed irremediably lost, was now being reborn under their shared care. "This is more than a hobby, isn't it?" she asked, suddenly comprehending the magnitude of what Harrison was doing. He nodded, his expression becoming more serious. "It's my way of accepting what's coming," he said quietly, "of preparing myself, of finding purpose in the time I have. I don't know how long my ability to paint as I do now will last. But plants, they respond even to imperfect hands." Eleanor placed the small pot with the rose cutting in a privileged spot on the table, next to the window where it would receive the best light. "I think it's wonderful," she said, taking his trembling hands in hers. "And I want to be part of this if you'll let me." The relief on Harrison's face was evident. Despite the advances in their relationship, there were still moments of insecurity, fears that the other might retreat in the face of the challenges they confronted. "Actually," he continued, recovering some of his initial enthusiasm, "I have another surprise related to this." He extracted an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "It arrived yesterday." Eleanor opened the envelope, finding an official document with the letterhead of the Thornfield Foundation. She read it quickly, her expression changing from curiosity to astonishment. "You've created a foundation to build therapeutic gardens in hospitals?" she asked, hardly believing what she was seeing. "And you want me to direct it?" Harrison nodded, his intense gaze fixed on her. "No one could do it better than you. You've demonstrated a natural talent, not just for growing plants, but for understanding how they can heal spaces and people." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "Besides, I want to ensure you have something of your own, something you're passionate about and that can sustain you, whatever happens with me." Eleanor felt a mixture of emotion and a pang of pain at the implication of his words. Harrison was planning not just for their life together, but also for when he would no longer be there. It was an act of love and foresight that deeply moved her. "I accept," she said finally, but with one condition. Harrison raised an eyebrow, waiting. That it be our joint project as long as you can participate. I don't want you preparing me for a future without you. I want us to build this together, in the present. Harrison's smile widened, revealing a relief so profound that Eleanor understood how much he had feared she would reject the proposal, or worse, that she would see it as a form of compensation for past mistakes. That seems fair, he agreed, sealing the pact with a handshake that naturally transformed into an embrace. As they remained thus, surrounded by the green promises of new life, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary turn their relationship had taken, from a marriage of convenience based on lies and revenge to a genuine partnership with shared purpose and meaning. That afternoon, as they worked together transplanting some of the seedlings to larger pots, Eleanor observed Harrison. His hands trembled notably as he tried to manipulate the delicate roots, but his face showed a serene concentration that she had come to associate with his most authentic moments. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you've declined several invitations to business events this month," Eleanor commented casually, though the implicit question was evident. Harrison nodded without raising his eyes from the plant he was transplanting. "The board of directors is pressuring me to name a successor," he responded with a frankness that would have been unthinkable months ago. "Some members are concerned about the progression of my condition. Others simply smell blood in the water. And you? Are you ready to step aside?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about how he viewed his professional future. Harrison finally looked up, and there was a serenity in his eyes that surprised Eleanor. "For the first time in my adult life, the Thornfield Empire doesn't seem so important," he confessed. "I've spent decades building it, protecting it, expanding it, as if it were the only way to honor my father's memory. Now I wonder if there aren't more meaningful ways to leave a legacy." He pointed to the sketches of the therapeutic garden, to the small seedlings that were beginning their life under their shared care. "Like this," he added, "creating healing spaces, using what we have to help others facing similar or worse challenges." Eleanor felt a wave of pride and admiration for the man Harrison was allowing himself to become. The ruthless businessman she had met on her wedding day was giving way to a multidimensional human being, capable of vulnerability and compassion. "Speaking of legacies," Harrison said, interrupting her thoughts, "there's something else I want to show you." He rose, cleaning the dirt from his hands on his already stained apron, and indicated that she should follow him to the back of the greenhouse, where a section was covered with a canvas. "I've been working on this during the nights," he explained, removing the canvas to reveal a series of canvases arranged in sequence. Eleanor held her breath. It was a pictorial narrative sequence, similar to a comic, but with Harrison's distinctive style. It showed the story of a young woman, clearly inspired by Eleanor, who discovered an abandoned garden and, through her patient care, not only revived the plants, but transformed everyone who came into contact with them. "It's beautiful," Eleanor murmured, absorbing the details of each panel, the meticulously captured expressions, the subtle symbolism in each composition. "Is it for the foundation?" Harrison nodded, visibly pleased by her reaction. "I thought we could convert it into an illustrated book for children in the hospitals where we implement the gardens. A way to explain the therapeutic purpose to them in a manner they can understand and enjoy." As Eleanor examined the illustrations, she noticed that the tremor in Harrison's hands had left its mark on some lines, creating a slightly undulating effect that, far from ruining the work, gave it an ethereal quality, as if the images vibrated with their own life. "Your imperfections make this even more beautiful," she said with sincerity, indicating these trembling lines. "They give your art a unique, unrepeatable quality." Harrison looked at her with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, as if she had articulated something he himself had been trying to accept. "Perhaps it's like that with people too," he responded after a moment. "Perhaps our cracks, our tremors aren't defects to hide, but part of what makes us unique." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the profound truth in his words. Both had come to this marriage with cracks, with wounds, with distorted expectations, and yet somehow those very imperfections had created space for a growth neither had anticipated. "I think you're right," she said, intertwining her fingers with his, tremor and firmness meeting halfway. "And I think we're just beginning to discover what we can create together." As the afternoon sun cast patterns of light through the glass roof of the greenhouse, illuminating the small seedlings that would someday be an exuberant garden, Eleanor felt a deep certainty that, regardless of the challenges the future held for them, they had found something precious and lasting, a shared purpose born of honesty, not obligation. The rebirth wasn't just of the plants they cared for together, but of themselves as individuals and as a couple. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Harrison asked, stopping the car in front of the elegant Mercer residence. Eleanor contemplated the house where she had grown up, feeling a strange mixture of nostalgia and determination. Almost 3 months had passed since her confrontation with her father, 3 months of absolute silence between them. "I need to close this chapter," she responded firmly. "Not for him, but for me." Harrison nodded, understanding. In recent weeks, they had talked extensively about their respective relationships with their parents, the adoration mixed with pressure Harrison had felt toward Arthur, the emotional distancing Eleanor had experienced with Whittaker. "Do you want me to come in with you?" he offered, though they both knew Harrison's presence would only intensify the tension of the encounter. Eleanor shook her head, briefly squeezing his hand before opening the car door. "This is something I have to do alone, but thank you for bringing me." The front door opened before she could ring the bell. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper who had practically raised her since childhood, received her with an emotional embrace. "Miss Eleanor, what a joy to see you," the woman whispered, discreetly wiping away a tear. "Your father is in his study." Eleanor advanced down the familiar corridor, noticing how everything remained exactly as when she had left. The same solemn portraits of ancestors, the same Persian rugs, the same oppressive silence that had always characterized the Mercer house. She knocked softly on the study door. "Come in," responded the authoritative voice that had dictated the course of her life for 21 years. Whittaker Mercer was exactly as she remembered him, seated behind his imposing mahogany desk, impeccably dressed, with that expression of distant superiority he seemed to reserve especially for his daughter. "Eleanor," he said, without rising or showing surprise. "You've finally come to your senses." She breathed deeply, reminding herself that she was no longer the docile young woman who had left this house almost a year ago. "Hello, Father." She sat before him without waiting for an invitation. "I've come to talk to you." Whittaker studied her with calculating eyes, evaluating the subtle but significant changes in his daughter, the more erect posture, the direct gaze, the serenity in her voice that hadn't been there before. "I suppose you've come to apologize for your inappropriate behavior," he commented with a condescending tone. "Fortunately, I've managed to contain the rumors about your little crisis." Eleanor almost smiled at the predictability of her father, always concerned with appearances, with what society might think. "I haven't come to apologize," she responded calmly. "I've come to understand." She extracted from her purse an old photograph, the image Mrs. Holloway had given her, where a young Whittaker smiled alongside Arthur Thornfield, with Vivian between them. "I want you to tell me about her," she said, sliding the photograph across the desk. "About Vivian Thornfield, about your engagement to her before you met Mother." Whittaker's face visibly paled. For the first time in Eleanor's memory, she saw her father genuinely caught off guard, without his usual mask of control. "Where did you get this?" His voice sounded hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you built an entire revenge based on a love you lost, and you used me as the final instrument of that revenge." Whittaker rose abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the garden. For long minutes he remained silent, his back toward her. When he finally spoke, his voice had a tone Eleanor had never heard, vulnerable, almost broken. "Vivian was extraordinary." The words seemed to cost him physical effort. "Brilliant, passionate, with a vision of the world that dazzled me from the first moment. We met at university, got engaged young, we had plans." He interrupted himself, and Eleanor saw how his shoulders, normally rigid with authority, sank slightly. "What happened?" she asked softly, recognizing how difficult this conversation was for both of them. "I met your mother at a high society party. The Lambert family had connections that the Caldwells, Vivian's family, didn't have." He finally turned, and Eleanor saw something she never thought possible, regret in her father's eyes. "I made a pragmatic decision. I broke my engagement with Vivian, married Charlotte. It was what was expected of me." "And did Mother know?" Did she know you were in love with another woman? Whitaker slowly shook his head. Your mother never knew the real reason. I told her it had been a youthful relationship of no importance. He made a painful pause. 3 months later, Vivian announced her engagement to Arthur Thornfield, my best friend at the time. They married quickly, had Harrison the following year. Eleanor was beginning to understand the tangle of pain, jealousy, and regret that had shaped decades of enmity. So when the opportunity arose in business, it was weakness, not strategy, Whitaker admitted, and it seemed that each word cost him a piece of his carefully constructed image. Seeing Vivian happy with Arthur, seeing the empire they were building together, it consumed me. When the opportunity to take control of the company arose, I didn't think twice. You never imagined Arthur would commit suicide, Eleanor conjectured. Whitaker let himself fall heavily into his chair, suddenly aged. That was never my intention. Arthur was always too sensitive. When everything collapsed for him, when he lost not just the company, but his reputation. He shook his head. After his death, Vivian never spoke to me again. Not even at social events where it was inevitable to coincide. And all of that justified using me, Eleanor asked, keeping her voice firm despite the emotion. Lying to me about our financial situation, forcing me into a marriage with the son of the man whose death you indirectly caused? Whitaker looked at her directly for the first time during the conversation. Harrison contacted me a 1.5 years ago. He knew he was ill, that he needed an heir. He offered a deal. Your hand in exchange for resolving certain legal complications that could have seriously affected our patrimony. He paused. It was he who suggested the bankruptcy farce. He said he knew my daughter well enough to know she would never agree to marry for money, but that her sense of family duty would make her sacrifice herself to save us. The revelation was like a physical blow to Eleanor. Harrison had planned the manipulation from the beginning, anticipating exactly how she would respond. He had studied her, analyzed her like an adversary, not as a future wife. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, struggling to maintain her composure. Why not continue with the lie? Whitaker sighed deeply. Because you resemble her too much, he finally said. Vivian, not in appearance, but in spirit. That quiet determination, that capacity to see goodness where others cannot. He gestured toward the photograph. I always avoided seeing those similarities because they reminded me of what I had lost, the decisions I made. But when you walked in today, with that new strength in your gaze, I couldn't keep denying it. A dense silence settled between them. Eleanor processed this new information, these final pieces of the puzzle that explained not just the conflict between the families, but also the cold distance her father had always maintained with her. Did you ever love Mother? She finally asked, needing to know the complete truth. Whitaker seemed surprised by the question. In my way, yes, he responded after a pause. Charlotte was an excellent wife, a devoted mother. With time, we developed a mutual affection, a respect. It wasn't the passion I felt for Vivian, but it was enough. Eleanor nodded, understanding more than her father imagined. She too had entered a loveless marriage expecting at most enough, and yet she had found much more. I forgive you, she said with a clear voice, surprising herself as much as her father. Not because what you did was right, but because I understand now that you too have been a prisoner of decisions made decades ago. Whitaker looked at her with genuine astonishment, as if seeing his daughter for the first time. You were always a better person than I, Eleanor, he said with unusual honesty. Charlotte would be proud of the woman you've become. The mention of her mother, who had passed away when Eleanor was only 12, brought tears to her eyes that she didn't try to hide. There's something else you should know, she continued, knowing this was the moment for complete truth. Harrison and I have decided to continue with our marriage, not out of obligation, not for the original agreement, but because we've found something valuable between us. Whitaker studied her at length, looking for signs of coercion or manipulation. Finding none, he slowly nodded. Are you happy? He asked with a sincerity Eleanor had never heard in his voice. I'm learning to be, she answered honestly, and I believe he is too. Whitaker rose, circling the desk to approach her. With awkward movements, unaccustomed to expressing affection, he placed a hand on her shoulder. Then perhaps something good has come from all this tragedy, he said, and for the first time, Eleanor felt she was speaking with her father, not with the patriarch of the Mercers. When Eleanor returned to the car where Harrison awaited her, she felt as if she had left an enormous weight behind. The conversation with her father hadn't magically repaired decades of emotional distancing, but it had opened a door both had believed permanently closed. Harrison looked at her questioningly as she settled into the passenger seat. "How did it go?" he asked cautiously. Eleanor turned to him, studying his face with new eyes, now that she knew more pieces of the story. "He told me everything," she said simply. "About Vivian, about their broken engagement, about how you planned our wedding from the beginning." Harrison visibly paled, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Eleanor, No," she interrupted him gently. "I don't need more explanations. I understand now the complete entanglement. Our parents, their loves, their betrayals, and us trapped in a story that began before our birth." She took his trembling hands in hers, compelling him to look at her. "What matters isn't how we began, but what we're building now." She made a significant pause. "My father asked if I'm happy with you. I told him the truth, that I'm learning to be." The tension in Harrison's face gradually dissolved, replaced by an expression of astonishment and gratitude. "After everything you discovered today, you still want—" "Yes," Eleanor responded firmly. "I want to continue building something ours, something not defined by the past, but with one condition." Harrison waited, visibly holding his breath. "That there never be secrets between us again," she said. "Not even those you believe will protect me or spare me pain. I want the whole truth, always. It's the only way we can truly be free." Harrison solemnly nodded. "I promise," he said, and Eleanor saw in his eyes that he understood the depth of that commitment. As the car moved away from the Mercer house, Eleanor felt she was leaving behind not just a physical place, but an entire chapter of her life. The future stretching before them was full of uncertainties. The progression of Harrison's disease, the challenges of the foundation they were creating together, the complicated family relationships they now had to rebuild. But for the first time, they faced these uncertainties with honesty and a shared purpose. Like the small seedlings in their greenhouse, their relationship had put down deep roots through unexpected storms. And now, against all odds, it was beginning to bloom. Winter had arrived in the countryside with unusual cold for the region. The gardens of Thornfield Manor slumbered under a thin layer of morning frost, and the bare trees extended their branches toward a pale sky that promised the first snow in years. In the greenhouse, however, a separate world was blooming. The carefully regulated heat and humidity had created an oasis where medicinal plants thrived under the attentive care of Eleanor and Harrison. The work tables were occupied with projects in different stages: seed trays, cuttings rooting in crystal-clear water, mature plants ready to be transplanted. It was the last day of the year, and Eleanor had spent the morning putting her notes in order for the inauguration of the first therapeutic garden of the Thornfield Foundation, scheduled for spring. The architectural plans, the lists of plants selected for their specific properties, the schedules of workshops and therapies, everything was beginning to take concrete form after months of planning. The sound of footsteps interrupted her concentration. Harrison entered the greenhouse with a strange expression, a mixture of enthusiasm and nervousness. He carried a small package wrapped in simple paper. "You were so concentrated you didn't want breakfast," he said, placing a steaming cup of tea next to her notes. Mrs. Holloway was worried. Eleanor smiled, thanking him for the gesture. In recent months, she had noticed how everyone in the mansion, from the housekeeper to the gardener, had moved from initial distrust to genuine acceptance. She was no longer seen as the imposed young wife, but as an integral part of the life of the house, and of Harrison's life. "I was finishing the details for the meeting with the hospital director," she explained, taking a sip of the herbal tea she recognized as a blend they had prepared together. "How was your session with the physiotherapist?" Harrison flexed his hands, showing how the specific exercises were helping to maintain mobility despite the advance of his condition. "Dr. Camden says I'm responding well to the new treatment," he replied, with a cautious optimism they had learned to cultivate regarding his disease. "The tremors haven't worsened in the last 2 months." Eleanor nodded, allowing herself a moment of relief. They had learned to celebrate small victories, periods of stability, without letting themselves be overwhelmed by the knowledge that Harrison's disease was progressive. "I have something for you," he said, sliding the small package across the table. An early New Year's gift. Eleanor looked at it with curiosity. During the past year, they had developed the custom of exchanging small presents that had more sentimental meaning than material value. A specially chosen book, a sketch capturing a shared moment, seeds of a particularly difficult plant to find. Upon unwrapping the package, she found a small carved wooden box. Opening it, she held her breath. On a bed of green velvet rested a delicate brooch in the shape of a rose, crafted in antique silver, with mother-of-pearl details that perfectly captured the petals of a Rosa alba maxima in full bloom. "Harrison, it's precious," she murmured, touching the piece with reverence. "Where?" "It belonged to my mother," he explained, and there was contained emotion in his voice. "It was her most prized possession, a gift from my father when I was born. For her it symbolized the flowering of our family." Eleanor looked up, understanding the profound meaning of the gift. "Are you sure you want me to have it?" Harrison nodded, taking the brooch to carefully pin it to the collar of her blouse. "My mother would have wanted someone who truly understood its meaning to have it," he said softly. "Someone who knew that the most beautiful things require care, patience, and the ability to see potential where others see only thorns." Their eyes met, and Eleanor saw in them an emotion so deep that words were unnecessary. They had come a long way since that wedding day, when they had united as strangers. The marriage that had begun as a transaction, a revenge, an obligation, had transformed into something neither had experienced before, a partnership based on mutual respect, admiration, and a love that had grown slowly, like the plants they cultivated together. "I have more news," Harrison continued, taking a seat across from her. "I spoke with the board of directors this morning. Starting tomorrow, I officially retire from the executive presidency of Thornfield Enterprises." Eleanor looked at him with surprise. Although they had discussed this possibility, she hadn't expected him to make the decision so soon. "Are you completely sure?" she asked, knowing how important the company had been to his identity for decades. Harrison nodded with a serenity that reflected the inner peace he had been finding in recent months. "I've never been more sure of anything," he responded. "I've named Lawrence Calloway as my successor. He's young, visionary, and shares our values about corporate social responsibility." He made a significant pause. "Besides, this will allow me to dedicate myself completely to the foundation and our projects together, at least while my health permits." Eleanor took his hands in hers, feeling the slight tremor that had become a familiar part of their physical connection. "I'm proud of you," she said with sincerity. "I know how difficult this decision was." "Actually, it was surprisingly easy," Harrison confessed. "When I finally separated what I really wanted from what I believed I should want, from what my father would have expected, the answer was clear." He rose, extending his hand to her. "Come with me. There's something else I want to show you." He led her to the back of the greenhouse, to a section they had reserved for special projects. There, in a privileged corner that received the best light, the small plant they had been caring for during months had experienced a miraculous transformation. The Rosa alba maxima, which until a few weeks ago was just a stem with some leaves, had produced its first bud. Small but perfectly formed, it promised the white flower with pink edges that Harrison had described so many times. "It's blooming," Eleanor murmured, kneeling to better observe the prodigy. "Despite the season, despite everything. Just in time for the end of the year," Harrison added, placing himself beside her. "A complete cycle since our wedding." Eleanor contemplated the bud, remembering the words he had shared months ago. "It begins with purity and becomes tinged with experiences." It was such a perfect metaphor for their own relationship that it almost seemed specifically designed for them. "Do you know what this means, don't you?" Harrison asked with an intensity in his gaze that captured all her attention. "This cutting, this new life we've cultivated together, it's our true beginning." He took both of Eleanor's hands in his, and although they trembled more than usual, his voice was firm and clear. "A year ago we married for the wrong reasons. A contract, not a commitment. A transaction, not a union." He paused, breathing deeply. "I want to ask you, Eleanor Mercer Thornfield, to be my wife again. Not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because you choose to share your life with me, with full knowledge of who I am, of my flaws and limitations, of the challenges we will face." Eleanor felt tears flowing freely, but unlike so many other times in her life, These were tears of pure, unrestricted emotion. "Yes," she responded simply. "I choose this. I choose you." Harrison extracted from his pocket a small ring that Eleanor immediately recognized, a simple gold band with a solitaire diamond that had belonged to her mother, Charlotte, the same ring her father had given her months ago in a gesture of reconciliation and acceptance of her choice. "Your father gave it to me yesterday," Harrison explained at her surprised look. "He said it was time you had it for the right reasons." As he slid the ring onto her finger, a ray of winter sunlight filtered through the greenhouse's glass roof, illuminating the rosebud like a presage of the blooming to come. In that moment, surrounded by the life they had cultivated together, Eleanor understood that they had reached the climax of their shared story. Not the end, for they still had many chapters to write, many challenges to face, but the culminating point of their transformation. From a marriage imposed by external circumstances, they had forged a freely chosen union. From two souls wounded by complex family legacies, they had created a new type of family based on honesty and mutual care. And like the Rosa alba maxima that was finally blooming against all odds in the middle of winter, their love had found a way to prosper in the most unlikely terrain, demonstrating that sometimes the most beautiful things are born precisely from the most adverse circumstances. 1 year and 1 day after their original wedding, Eleanor and Harrison renewed their vows in an intimate ceremony in the greenhouse they had built together. Unlike the opulent St. Matthew's Episcopal Church filled with guests they barely knew, this space overflowed with life and personal meaning. The medicinal plants they had cultivated with such care were the only witnesses, along with a handful of people who truly mattered: Mrs. Holloway, Giles the gardener, Whittaker Mercer, and Lawrence Calloway, the new president of Thornfield Enterprises. Eleanor wore a simple ivory dress, and in her hair, a small bouquet of flowers from the garden. Instead of the heavy traditional veil she had worn at her first wedding, she proudly displayed the silver rose brooch that had belonged to Vivian Thornfield. Harrison, for his part, had abandoned the formal black tailcoat for a light suit that better reflected the luminosity of the moment. Their hands intertwined during the brief ceremony, his trembling slightly, hers steady, a perfect symbol of how they complemented each other, of how the strength of one sustained the vulnerability of the other. "When we met," Harrison said in his vows, his voice clear and sure despite the emotion, "I was a man defined by the past, trapped in a story of loss and revenge that I had inherited without questioning. You taught me to see possibilities where I only saw inevitable endings. You showed me that abandoned gardens can bloom again, that hardened hearts can soften, that it's never too late to choose a different path." Eleanor, with contained tears that this time were not of resignation but of deep joy, responded, "I was a young woman who had never made true decisions of my own, who lived pleasing others' expectations. Through you, through our shared challenges, I found my voice. I learned that true strength isn't in resisting alone, but in daring to be vulnerable, in asking for help, in building bridges where once there were walls. You taught me that our imperfections aren't defects to hide, but essential parts of who we are." As they exchanged rings, hers, Charlotte's solitaire, his, a simple band Eleanor had specifically chosen for its comfort for hands with tremor, the afternoon sun penetrated through the glass roof, creating a kaleidoscope of colors among the plants. But the most symbolic moment came after the ceremony. Together they approached the Rosa alba maxima they had cultivated from a dying cutting. The flower had fully opened that morning, as if it had been waiting precisely for this day. Its white petals with soft pink tones at the edges perfectly captured the late afternoon light. Harrison, with the meticulous care that now characterized all his movements, cut the flower and offered it to Eleanor. She, instead of taking it for herself, carefully divided it into individual petals. Then, in a gesture that surprised all present, she began to distribute one petal to each person. "This rose," she explained with a clear voice, "represents not just our love, but the network of connections, care, and responsibilities we share. Each of you has been an essential part of our story, and we want you to carry with you this symbol of transformation and rebirth." When she reached her father, there was a palpable moment of tension. Whittaker Mercer, always dignified and contained, seemed uncomfortable with the emotional symbolism of the gesture. But when Eleanor offered him the petal, his fingers took it with unexpected delicacy. "Thank you for choosing to be here today," she said softly, "for choosing to be part of this new story we are writing." Whitaker nodded, and although there was no effusive embrace or dramatic declarations, the simple act of acceptance represented an enormous step in the healing of family wounds that had endured for decades. The small reception that followed the ceremony took place in the main garden of the mansion, now transformed into an exuberant space that reflected Eleanor's aesthetic sensibility combined with Harrison's artistic eye. Simple tables arranged under pergolas covered with flowering vines, soft lights hanging from the trees, and the aroma of aromatic herbs mixing with the fresh afternoon air. While the few guests conversed, Eleanor and Harrison moved away for a moment, walking along the paths she had designed between geometric beds and areas of more wild growth. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Eleanor pointed toward the mansion that rose in the distance, imposing as always but no longer intimidating. "About how spaces reflect those who inhabit them," she responded. "When I arrived here, this mansion seemed cold, oppressive, like a golden cage. The enormous empty rooms, the silent corridors, the neglected gardens. Everything was a perfect reflection of the man I believed you were, distant, rigid, trapped in the past." Harrison nodded, understanding exactly what she was referring to. "And now what do you see?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perception. Eleanor smiled, contemplating the subtle but significant changes that had transformed the property. "I see a place that breathes, that has its own life. The doors that once remained closed are now open. There are fresh flowers in rooms no one had visited in decades. You can hear laughter in the kitchen when Mrs. Holloway and Giles share afternoon tea." She paused, intertwining her fingers with his. "It's as if the house had awakened from a long lethargy, just like its owner." Harrison observed her with a mixture of admiration and gratitude that still surprised her with its intensity. "You did that," he said softly. "You brought life to this place, just as you brought it to me." They stopped beside a small fountain they had restored together, where crystalline water fell in musical cascades over ancient stones partially covered with moss. A perfect symbol of how the old and the new could coexist in harmony. "Do you know what's most extraordinary about all this?" Eleanor reflected. "That something so beautiful could be born from such a false beginning. Sometimes I think we should be grateful for the lies that united us, because they forced us to build something true from scratch." Harrison contemplated this paradox, nodding slowly. "My mother used to say that the best stories never follow a straight line," he recalled. "That it's the unexpected detours, the obstacles, even the mistakes, that create a tale worth telling." A soft call interrupted their private moment. Mrs. Holloway was approaching along the path with an expression that mixed apology and a certain urgency. "Pardon the interruption," said the elderly woman, "but someone has arrived whom we weren't expecting." Eleanor and Harrison exchanged a curious look as they followed the housekeeper toward the small reception. There, apart from the main group and clearly uncomfortable, waited an elegant woman of about 60. Her erect posture and penetrating gaze immediately reminded one of Harrison, though they had never seen her at the mansion before. "Elizabeth," Harrison murmured, with a mixture of surprise and tension in his voice. Eleanor immediately understood who she was. Elizabeth Thornfield, Harrison's older sister, who had cut ties with the family after their father's death and had lived abroad since then. In all the time of their marriage, Eleanor had never met her, and Harrison rarely mentioned her name. "I see I arrive at a moment of celebration," Elizabeth commented with a slight French accent. "I wouldn't have come if I had known." "No," Harrison interrupted, recovering from the initial surprise. "I'm glad you're here, truly." Eleanor observed the exchange with interest. The relationship between the Thornfield siblings was another of the family wounds that needed healing, another echo of the traumatic past that had shaped their lives. "I wanted to speak with you personally," Elizabeth continued, addressing her brother but casting evaluative glances toward Eleanor. "I received your letter about the foundation, about your condition." Harrison nodded, maintaining his composure, though Eleanor could feel the tension emanating from him. He had sent that letter months ago, without receiving a response until now. "This is Eleanor," he said, formally presenting his wife. "Eleanor, my sister Elizabeth." The two women evaluated each other with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Finally, it was Elizabeth who broke the ice. extending a hand with a gesture that powerfully recalled her brother. "I've heard much about you," she said with surprising frankness, "mainly from Whittaker Mercer, curiously. He contacted me a few weeks ago." This revelation surprised both Eleanor and Harrison. Her father had sought out Harrison's estranged sister. For what purpose? "My father tends to surprise when least expected," Eleanor commented, accepting the handshake firmly. Elizabeth sketched a faint but genuine smile. "He spoke to me of the changes he's seen in his daughter. And in my brother," she directed her gaze toward Harrison. "Enough to awaken my curiosity." Whittaker approached at that moment, as if he had perceived they were talking about him. The encounter between the three families that had been intertwined for generations, the Thornfields, the Mercers, the Lambers, created a strange sensation of closing a circle. "Elizabeth," Whittaker greeted with a formal nod of his head. "I'm glad you decided to come." "I'm still not sure I've made the right decision," she responded frankly. "There's too much history between us." "Precisely why we're all here," Eleanor intervened gently. "To acknowledge that history, but also to decide that it doesn't have to determine our future." Harrison observed his wife with admiration. In moments like this, he clearly saw how much she had grown from that resigned young woman who had walked toward the altar a year ago. Her capacity to face tense situations with grace and wisdom constantly astonished him. "My wife is right," he said, making a spontaneous decision. "And since we're all here, there's something I want to share with you." He led the small group toward a section of the garden that had remained covered with awnings during the last few weeks. With a gesture to Giles, who was discreetly waiting to the side, the canvases were removed to reveal a sculptural fountain of contemporary design. The centerpiece was an abstract representation of 3 intertwined roses, each in a different stage of blooming: a closed bud, a partially open flower, and a rose in full bloom. Water flowed gently between them, creating an effect of continuous movement and renewal. 3 generations, Harrison announced, revealing the name of the work, a tribute to the women who shaped our families, for better or worse. Vivian Thornfield, Charlotte Lambert Mercer, and Eleanor Mercer Thornfield. The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Whittaker contemplated the sculpture with an indescribable expression, while Elizabeth seemed to struggle with memories she had kept at bay for decades. "It's your work," Elizabeth finally said, recognizing her brother's artistic style. "I didn't know you still painted." "I never stopped," Harrison responded. "Though for many years I kept it a secret, like so many other important things." Their eyes met, and something passed between the Thornfield siblings, a silent recognition of all they had lost, of all the time wasted in resentments and silences. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth finally said, with a sincerity that seemed to cost her effort. "Mother would have been proud." Eleanor observed how Harrison absorbed these words, how their impact was reflected in the sudden moisture of his eyes. It was a simple comment, but it contained the recognition he had yearned for during decades, that his art had value, that his sensitivity wasn't weakness. Whittaker, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "The 3 most extraordinary women I've known," he said with a voice that rarely revealed emotion, "each one in her way stronger than any of us." He looked at his daughter, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that had never been there before, not just respect, but a kind of wonder, as if he were finally seeing her completely. As the sun began to set, tinging the sky with copper and gold tones, the 4 remained beside the fountain, united not so much by the shared past, but by the possibility of a different future. There were no guarantees that all wounds would completely heal, that all broken bridges would be rebuilt. But there was something that hadn't existed before, the willingness to try. Later, when the guests had departed, and the mansion had returned to its habitual tranquility, Eleanor and Harrison found themselves again in the greenhouse. Moonlight filtered through the glass roof, creating silver patterns on the plants they had cultivated together. Harrison approached the place where they had cut the Rosa alba maxima for the ceremony. The stem, though stripped of its flower, already showed signs of new buds. "It will bloom again," he observed, with that mixture of pragmatism and hope that had come to define him. Stronger this time, with deeper roots. Eleanor approached him, resting her head on his shoulder as they contemplated the resilient plant together. "Like us," she said softly. Harrison nodded, wrapping an arm around her waist. His hands trembled more than usual after the long day, but neither of them cared. The tremor was simply part of them now, neither defining nor limiting, just one more aspect of their shared reality. "Do you know what your father told me before he left?" Harrison asked. Eleanor shook her head, curious. "He told me he finally understands why Vivian chose me," Harrison responded, with a smile that mixed astonishment and a certain irony. "That he sees in me what she must have seen in my father, someone who, despite all his imperfections, was capable of loving without reservations when he found the right person." Eleanor considered these words, this unexpected recognition from her father. "And you? What did you answer?" "I told him he was right," Harrison replied simply, "and that it took me too long to understand that this capacity wasn't a weakness, but my greatest strength." He turned to her, taking her face between his trembling hands with infinite delicacy. "I love you, Eleanor Mercer Thornfield," he said, with a clarity and certainty that resonated in the quiet greenhouse, "not as one loves a precious possession or a valuable work of art, but as one loves someone who has shown you a version of yourself you didn't know existed. Someone who has taught you to bloom even in the most improbable conditions." Eleanor felt her heart expanding, with an emotion she no longer needed to name or explain. It was simply the certainty of having found her place in the world, not through imposed circumstances or others' expectations, but through conscious choices and hard-won authenticity. "And I love you," she responded, holding his trembling hands against her face. "Not despite your imperfections, but with them, through them, for all that you are, for all that we've built together from the most improbable foundations." As they kissed under the silver moonlight, surrounded by the plants they had rescued and nurtured with patience and dedication, Eleanor thought about the extraordinary journey they had traveled, from forced marriage to freely chosen love, from distrust to the deepest intimacy, from two wounded and isolated souls to a resilient team with shared purpose. The life that awaited them wouldn't be easy. Harrison's disease would eventually progress. There would be difficult days, challenges to face, moments of doubt and fear. But now they had something that neither had truly had before, the certainty of not being alone, of being seen and loved in their most complete truth. Like the Rosa alba maxima they had rescued from extinction, their love had bloomed against all odds, finding light where there seemed to be only shadows, nurturing deep roots in soil that seemed sterile. And like the rose, it would continue to bloom year after year, changing and evolving with the seasons of life, but always recognizable in its essence. Because some stories, even those that begin with lies and manipulations, have the potential to transform into something true. Some flowers, even those that seem withered beyond all salvation, harbor within them the promise of an extraordinary rebirth. And some loves, especially those forged through trials and challenges, acquire a strength that no storm can break, a brightness that not even the darkest night can extinguish.